The room went dead silent when she walked past. Sarah Chen didn't register the silence. She never did. Her hands moved through the medication cart with the precision of someone who had performed these tasks 10,000 times, each vial placed, each syringe labeled, each movement economical and invisible. The fluorescent lights hummed above her like a swarm of insects trapped in plastic, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made time feel suspended. It was 0300 hours. The night shift at Cedar Creek Medical stretched ahead of her like a dark corridor with no doors, which was exactly how she needed it. She had been walking these halls for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of purposeful invisibility. 6 weeks of keeping her head down, avoiding eye contact in the break room, eating her sandwich alone at the corner table where nobody Saturday. The other nurses had stopped trying to include her by week 2. Good. That was the mission. Blend. Disappear. Become the kind of person people looked through instead of at. Become the kind of nurse that doctors didn't think twice about, that residents didn't remember, that administrators left alone. Her scarred forearms, thin lines running down to her knuckles, souvenirs from a field thoracotomy performed with a combat knife in a compound 3 kilometers outside Bagram, were hidden beneath long sleeves even in summer. The faded Special Forces unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining pressed against her ribs with each breath, a weight that never lifted, a reminder of why she was really here instead of anywhere else a captain with her clearance level could have been assigned. Room 347 was dark except for the pale glow of the monitor. Sarah entered without knocking, moving with a quiet efficiency that made her footsteps barely audible on the tile. Sergeant David Torres lay in the hospital bed the way he always did, perfectly still, his paralyzed legs arranged beneath the thermal blanket in the exact same position as yesterday and the day before. The shrapnel that had taken his mobility had taken it cleanly, a vertical line of severance at Tier 12, the kind of injury that looked almost surgical in its precision. His breathing was steady. His eyes tracked her movement as she approached, dark and sharp and aware. He had been a good medic. He was a good patient. He was also the reason she was here. Evening vitals, she said, keeping her voice soft and neutral. She didn't make eye contact. That wasn't part of the invisibility protocol. Torres's jaw tightened slightly. 0300, you're early. Night shift protocol. She slipped the blood pressure cuff onto his arm with practiced efficiency, the Velcro catching with a soft ripping sound. How's the pain? Same. He paused. A measured breath. Captain, I need to. She shook her head, so small the movement was barely visible. The monitor beeped as the cuff inflated. Not now. Not here. Eyes on the monitor if anyone passes. BP 118/71. Normal. His oxygen sat was holding at 97% on room air. His heart rate steady at 62, athlete's baseline, even with the paralysis. She wrote everything down in the chart with meticulous detail, recording not just the numbers but the quality of his breathing, the color of his skin, the way his hands rested on the blanket. The charting went beyond what standard nursing required. It was the kind of documentation that captured everything, patterns, inconsistencies, the small things that could mean medication diversion or something worse. That was the mission. Monitor. Document. Report to the encrypted phone that sat in her apartment, silent and waiting for her handler's voice. Torres watched her write. How much longer? As long as it takes. She finished the chart, her handwriting precise and small, and turned to leave. That was when she heard the footsteps in the corridor outside. Deliberate footsteps. Shoes with a high shine, the kind that clicked against tile with purpose and authority. Sarah's hand paused on the door handle for exactly one fraction of a second before she moved through it, closing it softly behind her. The footsteps belonged to Dr. Marcus Pierce, who was arriving for early rounds at an hour when most physicians were still asleep. He was moving through the ICU wing with the confidence of someone who owned the building, which, in a sense, he did. The chief of staff position carried weight that extended far beyond the organizational chart. Sarah had encountered him precisely once, on her first day at Cedar Creek Medical. He had been reviewing charts near the nurse's station, his silver hair swept back with the kind of precision that suggested a personal groomer rather than a barber, his white coat tailored in a way that suggested money that went back 3 generations. When she had introduced herself, he had looked at her the way someone might look at a piece of furniture they were considering replacing. The look had lasted 3 seconds. Then he had turned back to his chart. She had been relieved. The less he noticed, the better. But he was noticing now. She felt it the way an animal feels pressure changes before a storm arrives. Pierce emerged from the stairwell and moved toward the nurse's station, his eyes scanning the charts that were stacked there, the documentation from the night shift. She watched him pick up Sergeant Torres's chart from the 3rd stack, the one with her careful notes, her meticulous recordings of vitals and observations that went far beyond the standard template. His eyes moved across her handwriting. His jaw tightened. He looked up, and for one instant, his gaze found hers across the 30 feet of open floor. She was already turning away, already moving toward the medication cart, already becoming invisible again. But she had seen his expression. She had seen the calculation in his eyes. He was the kind of man who noticed competence the way a predator notices weakness in a herd. He was already cataloguing her. Already assessing. Already deciding whether she was an asset or a threat. What she didn't know yet was that he had already decided. She was a threat. The next 3 hours passed in the rhythm of standard night shift work. Sarah moved through the corridors of Cedar Creek Medical with the practiced grace of someone who had been doing this for years. The 4 lines she inserted went in smoothly, the medications she administered were documented with precision, the patients she tended received the kind of quiet competence that made the work invisible. That was the goal. That was always the goal. The best nursing, like the best soldiering, was the kind that nobody noticed because everything worked exactly as it should. She passed the break room at 0345 and heard laughter. 2 residents were standing near the coffee machine, their voices carrying the particular tone of people sharing information they shouldn't. She didn't slow down. She didn't listen. But the words came anyway, carried on the artificial air that moved through the hospital's ventilation system with the sound of white noise and institutional efficiency. Credentials look questionable. The first voice said. Male. Uncertain. Trying on doubt like a new uniform. Pierce mentioned it, the second voice responded. Female. Older. The tone of someone who had learned to trust authority above all else. Said he's seen some inconsistencies. He's going to look into it personally. Sarah kept walking. Her hands didn't tremble. Her pace didn't change. Her breathing remained steady and measured, the way it always did, the way it had remained steady during a field amputation in a compound outside Bagram when the casualty had been screaming and blood had been everywhere and her hands had moved anyway because that was what hands did when they had been trained to do them. Pain was information. Doubt was information. The whispers that would grow into rumors were information, and information could be categorized and filed and processed later. The medication cart rolled smoothly under her fingers. The last patient on the evening list was in room 212, a 73-year-old with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease who was improving steadily under the current treatment protocol. Sarah checked his oxygen saturation, 94% on 2 liters nasal cannula, and made a notation to increase the flow rate by half a liter if he dipped below 90 during the next round. The old man was sleeping, his breath coming in the slow, measured rhythm of genuine rest. She left him undisturbed. By 0430, the night shift had settled into its particular stillness. The hospital hummed around her like a living thing, monitors beeping their steady pulse, ventilators whooshing their mechanical breath, the distant sound of an elevator opening and closing somewhere in the cardiac wing. Sarah sat at the nurse's station and pulled up the electronic chart system, her fingers moving across the keyboard with the same precision she applied to everything else. Her documentation was flawless. Every vital sign recorded. Every observation noted. Every action justified by protocol and supported by clinical reasoning. If anyone looked, they would find only competence. If anyone looked deeper, they would find a woman who documented her work as if someone might have to explain every decision to a court of law someday. She didn't know that Dr. Pierce was already making calls. She didn't know that he was speaking to attending physicians in the morning, his voice smooth and concerned, his words carefully chosen to plant seeds of doubt. She didn't know that by sunrise, at least 3 senior staff members would have heard that the new night shift nurse had questionable credentials, that her documentation seemed excessive, that her background might not be what it appeared to be. She was doing her job. She was monitoring Sergeant Torres. She was protecting her cover. She was invisible. But invisibility, she was about to learn, had a shelf life. And Dr. Marcus Pierce had just started the clock ticking toward the moment when she wouldn't be able to hide anymore. The fluorescent lights hummed their unchanging song above her head, indifferent to what was coming, indifferent to the storm that was beginning to gather in the careful, surgical way that storms gathered when they were orchestrated by men who had power and nothing left to lose. The conference room at Cedar Creek Medical smelled like stale coffee and institutional ambition. 20 residents and attending physicians packed the space for grand rounds, their white coats creating a uniform wall of credentialed certainty. Sarah stood against the back wall, her navy scrubs making her nearly invisible among the pressed linen and embroidered names. She had learned invisibility the way soldiers learn to read terrain. It kept you alive, kept you unnoticed, kept your mission intact. Dr. Marcus Pierce held up her charting notes like contaminated evidence, his fingers pinching the corner of the paper as though it might transmit something infectious. His voice carried the particular cruelty of men who had inherited authority rather than earned it, each word delivered with surgical precision. "This," he announced, "is what we call dangerous nursing overreach." He let the phrase hang in the recycled air. Notice the differential diagnoses documented here. Our night nurse, Florence Nightingale here, has apparently decided she's qualified to analyze patient presentation beyond vital sign reporting. Notice the presumption. The arrogance of someone who thinks 12 weeks of community college makes them a physician. Laughter rippled through the room like applause at her execution. Soft. Practiced. The laughter of people who understood the social hierarchy and were grateful not to be standing where Sarah stood. Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That was all. Her hands remained perfectly still at her sides, positioned with the kind of military discipline that made standing still look like an art form. Her breathing did not change. She might as well have been carved from stone, the kind of stone that endures, unchanging, while the weather moves across its surface. Pierce continued, his momentum building on the energy of the room. "I've seen this before. People who couldn't make it through medical school, playing dress-up with real responsibility. Taking shortcuts because they lacked the intellectual rigor for the legitimate path." He turned a page in her chart, his expression conveying profound disappointment with her entire existence. "When I came to Cedar Creek, I made a commitment to restore standards. To ensure that actual medical judgment comes from people with actual medical training. Not from well-meaning amateurs who chart like they learned medicine from a television show." More laughter. A resident in the front row even nodded, performing agreement for the attending physicians who would write his evaluation. Sarah's eyes remained fixed on a point on the wall behind Pierce's head. Not looking at him. Not looking at the residents who were learning that mocking the night shift nurse was socially acceptable. Not looking at the 2 junior physicians in the third row who suddenly seemed very interested in their coffee cups. Her composure was absolute. It was the composure of someone who had been shot at and continued walking. Who had held dying soldiers in her hands while keeping her voice steady. This was nothing. This was a man with a title performing dominance for an audience that needed him to be impressive because they needed titles to mean something. The meeting ended with Pierce's voice still filling the room, some closing remarks about standards and accountability that nobody would remember. Residents began gathering their materials, checking pagers, the low hum of conversation resuming. Sarah waited until the flow reversed, until people were moving toward the exits, then she moved with the tide, her steps measured and even, her face the blank professional mask of a healthcare worker transitioning between tasks. The break room was narrow and fluorescent bright, populated by a refrigerator that hummed like an electric insect. Sarah inserted quarters into the vending machine with steady hands. Black coffee. No sugar. No cream. The kind of coffee that matched her voice, clean, direct, impossible to misinterpret. The machine's mechanism ground and clicked, dispensing her choice without hesitation. Sarah. Dr. Ramirez's voice came from behind her. She had worked beside him for 3 months. He had asked her opinion on a patient's deteriorating kidney function. She had been right. His patient improved after she suggested the medication adjustment. "We're heading to the cafeteria. You want to come?" She turned. Dr. Ramirez and Dr. Thompson stood in the doorway, their body language suddenly different, closed, careful, the way people stand when they're about to do something they've been told they should do. They exchanged a glance that lasted approximately 1 second. A negotiation. A decision. Then Ramirez looked at his shoes, gathered his coffee cup from the counter, and moved toward the exit. Dr. Thompson followed him without meeting Sarah's eyes. She watched them leave. Her hands did not shake. Her coffee did not tremble. She completed her sip with the same measured precision she would use to document vital signs, and she returned to her rounds. The hospital corridors at 0830 on a Tuesday morning were populated with visitors and staff, the normal chaos of a facility where people were trying to heal and people were trying to practice, and somewhere in that collision of intention and reality, Sarah moved through it all like a ghost in scrubs. Her patient in room for 12 was Sergeant Marcus Torres, 26 years old, spinal cord compression at T4 from shrapnel taken during an operation she had been investigating for the past 8 months. He had replaced her as unit medic at Forward Operating Base Shank in Loga Province. He had been good at the job. Better than good. Then the IED went off during the convoy, and his spine took the metal that might have taken her. That was the calculation of war. That was the reason she was here, documenting everything, watching for the pattern in the medication logs that suggested someone was stealing drugs meant for pain management and selling them in Savannah streets. Torres looked up when she entered. His face was the kind of young that said the military had only recently stopped being a game and had started being a reckoning. "Morning, Nurse Chen." "Good morning, Sergeant." Her voice was the voice of a competent professional, nothing more. Nothing less. She began checking his fall line, her movements efficient and practiced. "How's your pain level today?" "4 out of 10. Better than yesterday." He paused. "I heard Dr. Pierce this morning. From the hallway. Pretty rough." Sarah did not look up from her task. Dr. Pierce has standards. The hospital is fortunate to have someone committed to oversight. Torres said nothing. He was smart enough to recognize the sound of someone protecting their position by performing agreement with an attack. The rest of her shift proceeded with the kind of mechanical precision that required no emotional investment. She checked vitals. She documented observations. She moved through the hospital like a woman constructed entirely of protocols and muscle memory. At 1600, when the day shift arrived and she prepared to leave, she passed Dr. Pierce in the corridor near the medication storage room. His expression shifted when he saw her, a smile blooming across his face like something cultivated in a greenhouse. "Still here, Florence?" His voice carried genuine warmth, which somehow made it worse than anger. "I would have thought you'd save us all the embarrassment and resign by now. Make it easy on yourself. Cedar Creek is a teaching hospital. We maintain certain standards. Surely you understand." Sarah met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. "I understand, Dr. Pierce." She continued walking. Her car was parked in the employee lot on the north side of the facility, 3 rows back from the entrance. The Savannah humidity was already thick enough to taste at 1630, the kind of heat that made the asphalt steam slightly and turned the world into something soft and difficult to move through. She sat in the driver's seat with the doors closed and the engine off, her hands positioned on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, her breathing controlled and even. The supply closet was located on the 4th floor, accessible through the stairwell in the east wing. Sarah climbed the stairs at 0400, her footsteps soundless on the concrete because she had learned how to move quietly in places where being heard meant being caught. The closet was small, maybe 4 feet by 6 feet, lined with boxes of gloves and gauze and saline solution. She closed the door and stood in the darkness for 3 seconds. Then she closed her eyes. She allowed herself 3 slow breaths. In through the nose. The smell of cardboard and bleach, and something underneath both of those, the smell of institutions, of places where people managed other people's suffering. Out through the mouth. Her hand found the inside of her jacket, where the faded unit patch was sewn into the lining, where the colors had bled slightly into each other over the years, where a symbol of everything she had been was hidden beneath a nurse's scrubs. She did not take it out. She did not look at it. She simply touched it the way people touch prayer beads or lucky coins, the way you touch something that reminds you of a version of yourself that had disappeared. Her eyes opened. The mask returned. Not quickly. Not with effort. It simply settled back into place the way she had trained it to, the way all good soldiers train their faces, as a tool, as a surface, as something separate from the person underneath. She walked out of the supply closet at 0404 and returned to her rounds, her charting impeccable, her assessments precise, her presence so neutral it was nearly invisible. But something had changed. Something in the way Pierce's attacks were starting to escalate from verbal to systematic. Something in the way hospital administration had begun taking calls from a man who had positioned himself as the guardian of institutional standards. Something in the encrypted message that would arrive in her personal phone at 0730, mission compromise likely. Handler requesting immediate extraction protocols review. Do not respond to this frequency. Sarah sat in her car in the parking garage at 0200, the phone glowing in her lap, her finger hovering over the button that would end everything. But Torres was 3 floors above her, his medical file full of gaps that only she understood, the medication pattern still incomplete, the conspiracy still unfinished. She closed the phone without responding. Inside the hospital, she passed Pierce in the hallway one more time. He smiled with practiced concern, the smile of a man who believed he was winning, who did not yet understand that he had been sparring with someone whose entire existence was classified. The night shift schedule posted at 0600 on Friday showed Sarah Chen reassigned to pediatric floors, rotating with 3 nurses she'd never worked alongside, separated from Torres by an institutional wall as impenetrable as concrete. Pierce had orchestrated it with surgical precision, every name on the new rotation was tied to his department, every shift staggered so overlap with her former team became impossible. She stood at the bulletin board near the break room, her eyes tracking the changes with a kind of clarity that came from reading tactical maps, and the message was unmistakable: isolation. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A nurse named Judith passed behind her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and said nothing. They had shared 3 night shifts together. Now Judith kept her eyes forward and moved faster. The email arrived in her personal account at 0847, before Sarah had even completed her first day on the pediatric rotation. Official letterhead from Human Resources, signed by Dr. Pierce himself, flagged her security access for immediate downgrade pending a full credentials investigation. The notification was dated the previous day, it had been in motion before grand rounds, before the email that morning, before the schedule change. Strategic. Everything about his moves was strategic now, moving from social poison into something sharper, something with teeth. Her badge still worked for the main corridors, but intensive care was locked out. Medication dispensary access revoked. Patient record modifications restricted. The electronic walls closed in on her systematically, each one cutting off another avenue to monitor Torres, another pathway to complete her mission. She held the phone in her hand, staring at the words pending investigation completion, knowing exactly what this was, the foundation for a termination notice. By Wednesday, Torres was running a low-grade fever that the day shift had logged as post-operative inflammation, routine, expected, nothing. Sarah caught him during her mandatory break, slipping into his room for exactly 90 seconds, and what she saw made her training kick into overdrive. His respirations were elevated. 16 breaths per minute instead of his baseline of 12. His fingertip oxygen saturation was 92% on room air, not dangerous yet, but trending downward over the past 48 hours instead of improving. His left leg showed the faintest swelling around the calf, the kind a casual observer would miss. The kind that screamed deep vein thrombosis to anyone trained to read a combat casualty's body like a field manual. Pulmonary embolism. That's what the body was telling her. His lungs were working to move blood through compromised vessels. His heart was compensating with increased rate. The fever was inflammation from a clot trying to dissolve on its own. She documented everything in her personal encrypted notes, not the hospital system, something that would never show up in his chart but would exist the moment her handler asked for proof. Dr. Reston was the attending physician on Wednesday night, a man in his 50s who'd served 15 years at Cedar Creek and had learned to navigate hospital politics by staying neutral, which meant staying quiet. Sarah found him at the nursing station at 2200 with her observations written out in clinical language, no emotion, just data. Elevated respirations, decreased O2 saturation on serial measurements, unilateral lower extremity edema. Recommend imaging for deep vein thrombosis and possible pulmonary embolism protocol. She placed the paper on the counter. Reston read it with his eyes only, not picking it up, as if the act of touching it might contaminate him. Dr. Pierce warned us you'd try something like this, Reston said quietly, not looking at her. The patient is stable. Do your job, nurse. She didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She gathered the paper and returned to Torres's room where her hands moved on their own, checking his foresight, adjusting his blankets, her movements precise and efficient and devoid of the panic crawling through her chest. Pain is information, her instructor had said 17 years ago at Fort Bragg. Pain is data. Fear is data. She gathered the information and continued working. At 0245, Torres's oxygen saturation dropped to 88% on room air. The monitor showed the change like a knife through silence, a single sharp beep that meant the threshold had been breached. Sarah was standing 5 feet away and moved before the monitor finished its first alarm. She increased his oxygen to 2 liters via nasal cannula, watching the numbers climb, 89, 90, 91, and then plateau at 91 where it held, stubborn. She paged Dr. Reston with a code text, patient O2 sat dropped to 88, now 91 on supplemental. Request evaluation. He arrived 11 minutes later, moving with the deliberate slowness of a man who believed he was being called for nothing. He glanced at the monitor. Looked at Torres's chest rising and falling. Oxygen supplementation. That's what you're doing. Good. This is exactly what the protocol calls for. He's fine. His saturation is trending downward across the shift, Sarah said. Her voice was level, coupled with the fever and the edema. Stop, Reston said. The word was quiet but it landed like a door slamming. This is exactly the overreach Dr. Pierce mentioned. You're a nurse, Chen. You monitor. You report. You don't diagnose, you don't worry, you don't obsess. You're frightening yourself and probably the patient. Follow the standing orders and call me if his saturation drops below 85. Otherwise, let him rest. He left. She stood at the bedside with her hands gripping the rail so hard her knuckles turned white, and watched Torres's lips for the color change that only came when cells started dying, when oxygen debt accumulated faster than the body could compensate. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their endless mechanical hymn. Rain hammered the windows, Savannah's November storm moving in like artillery across open water. Torres's breathing had taken on a quality she recognized from Bagram, from the field hospital tent at Forward Operating Base Shank, from the moment before everything changed. The sound of someone whose lungs were filling with something they weren't supposed to hold. At 0312, his oxygen saturation slipped to 89% despite the supplemental oxygen. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. Torres's eyes opened, confused, his hand reaching for the oxygen mask as if he could fix his own breathing through willpower. Sarah had her fingers on the call button when the doorway darkened. Pierce stood silhouetted against the hallway light, his white coat making him look like an angel until you saw his face. He'd been called. Of course he'd been called. Nurse Chen, he said, and his voice was the voice of a man who'd already won, who was simply announcing victory to someone who hadn't yet noticed the battlefield had shifted. I need you to step away from this patient. Your obsession is bordering on harassment. I'm reassigning you to administrative duties effective immediately. Security will escort you to human resources to process your separation papers. You're done here. Sarah's hands released the call button slowly, deliberately. She looked at Torres, whose chest heaved with the effort of breathing, whose fingers plucked at his blankets in the way of someone slowly suffocating. She looked at Pierce, who stood between her and the door like a sentry guarding the gates of her own banishment. Every piece of her training, every protocol, every operational directive screamed at her to walk. Maintain cover. Preserve the mission. Extract before exposure. The patch inside her jacket, the faded unit patch sewn into the lining of her uniform jacket, the one that had traveled with her through 3 combat tours and 2 different identities, seemed to burn against her ribs. "Doctor," she said, and her voice had changed in that single moment, had dropped an octave and shed the deferential uncertainty like a snake shedding skin. "I believe this patient is experiencing acute pulmonary embolism. His saturation is declining. His respiratory rate is elevated. His signs are consistent with massive clot burden. If you don't order imaging and anticoagulation in the next 15 minutes, he will arrest. You will lose him." Pierce's face went white, not from fear but from the shock of insubordination, from a nurse who was supposed to shuffle away quietly now standing in the center of her own defiance with the kind of certainty that belonged to someone who'd already survived the worst the world could offer. "I don't care what you believe, Florence," he said, using the nickname like a weapon, like a final insult before the blade fell. "Leave. Now." But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Sarah Chen, Captain Sarah Chen, didn't leave. She turned her back on Dr. Pierce and pressed the call button for code blue, and in that single moment of choice, she burned every bridge, blew every cover, and made her stand. The monitor's electronic beeping shifted into a different rhythm at 02 for 7 hours. Sarah noticed it first, the subtle change in Sergeant Torres's oxygen saturation curve on the central station display, a downward drift so gradual that most nurses would miss it entirely. 88%. Then 86. She'd seen this exact pattern before, in a field aid station outside Bagram where a medevac helicopter was 30 minutes out and a Marine's lung was collapsing from a tiny air leak that had nothing to do with the shrapnel in his spine. Pain is information. So is a pulse oximeter trending down. She moved to Torres's bedside with the quiet efficiency that had kept her invisible for 3 months. His breathing was shallow now, his lips beginning to lose the healthy pink flush they'd carried that morning. The color draining from his face happened so gradually that the monitors lagged behind the reality of what her eyes could see. She checked his gown, his positioning, the endotracheal tube placement. Everything was technically correct. Everything looked fine on paper. But something in the mechanics of his breathing had shifted, the rise and fall of his chest less symmetrical, his accessory muscles engaging when they shouldn't be working at all. She reached for the phone to call the on-call resident. Then she stopped. The on-call was Dr. Reston, who'd been in the break room when Dr. Pierce had systematically demolished her credibility in front of the entire night team. Reston had nodded along, had offered that tight little smile that meant he'd already decided she was a liability. If she called with concerns about Torres, Reston would respond with the minimum effort, dismiss her clinical observations, maybe even remove her from the case entirely. The security badge hanging from her lanyard had already been flagged. The access restriction had already been implemented. Dr. Pierce had made sure everyone knew she was a liability, a danger, a fraud-playing nurse. Sarah stood at Torres's bedside and made a calculation. 3 minutes. That's all it would take for his oxygen saturation to drop another 5 points. 81%. 78. At that threshold, the risk of sudden decompensation shifted from possible to inevitable. She'd spent 12 years reading vital signs in environments where the nearest doctor was an hour away by helicopter. Her hands knew what her credentials file claimed she didn't. She pressed the call button for code blue at 0251. What happened next happened like muscle memory, like hands that had performed the same procedure in a dust storm outside Kandahar and in a desert trauma tent and during a medevac that lost power for 90 seconds while she held a man's chest cavity together with her bare hands. The code team arrived within 2 minutes, led by Dr. Reston, who moved with the fluid hesitation of someone responding to a drill rather than a crisis. Behind him came 3 nurses and a respiratory therapist, and they brought the crash cart like pallbearers carrying something inevitable. Torres's oxygen saturation had dropped to 80%. His lips had turned the color of a bruise. Dr. Reston shouted orders, "Get the crash cart positioned, I want a 12-lead EKG, where's the arterial line kit?" The words came out in the right sequence, the right clinical vocabulary, but they had the quality of someone reading from a script they'd memorized but never truly understood. The nurses moved in the choreography of a code that had been drilled 1,000 times, but the movements were slow, uncertain, a half-second too late. Someone couldn't find the defibrillator pads. Someone else was assembling the arterial line with fumbling fingers. Then Torres flatlined. The monitor screamed. The room contracted around the sound of that single high-pitched wail, the universal language of catastrophe, the noise that meant 70 seconds until irreversible brain damage, 90 seconds until the human body became something that could be resuscitated but never truly recovered. Sarah watched the code team freeze for exactly 1 moment, that millisecond hesitation that meant they weren't sure what came next, weren't sure if they could stop what was already in motion. Her training didn't ask permission. Her training simply took over. She moved toward the crash cart. Her hands found the scalpel before her mind finished the decision, the blade familiar in her palm like an instrument she'd held 1,000 times. She ripped open Torres's hospital gown with one motion, her fingers already counting ribs by feel alone, first rib at the clavicle, then the anatomical landmarks that belong to a body the way a keyhole belongs to a specific key. 4th intercostal space, midclavicular line. This was tension pneumothorax. This was air accumulating in the space between lung and chest wall, pressure rising with each breath, crushing the lung flat, preventing the heart from filling, killing the patient in real time while everyone watched. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle. The hiss of escaping air filled the room like a sudden exhalation, like a tire deflating, like the sound of relief made audible. Color flooded back into Torres's face in real time. His oxygen saturation jumped from 76% to 84% in the space of 3 heartbeats. The monitor shifted from the flatline scream to the blessed, rhythmic beep of sinus rhythm, his own heart, beating on its own, perfusing his own blood to his own brain. 70 seconds. Total. From collapse to stabilization. The room went so thick with silence you could hear the ventilator wheeze its mechanical rhythm, could hear the fluorescent overhead lights emit their characteristic hum, could hear Dr. Reston's breathing accelerate as the reality of what had just happened crashed over him like cold water. Sarah stepped back from the bedside, the scalpel still in her gloved hand, and watched his face move through shock, confusion, and finally, the terrible clarity of understanding. She'd just saved a man's life. She'd just performed a surgical procedure. She'd just blown apart every wall that had been carefully built between the nurse she was supposed to be and the person she actually was. Footsteps. Running footsteps. Dr. Pierce arrived at the code room entrance before Sarah had finished removing her gloves, his face a landscape of raw triumph and barely concealed righteousness, the expression of a man who'd finally caught proof of everything he'd been claiming all along. "What the hell did you just do?" Dr. Reston's voice came out thin, uncertain, like a question he already knew the answer to. Dr. Pierce's voice cut through the room like a blade. "That's it. Nurse Chen, you just performed a surgical procedure without license or authorization. Security. Escort her out of this hospital immediately." His words came wrapped in the kind of carefully controlled rage that had been building for 3 months, the rage of a man whose institutional power was finally being used exactly as he'd always intended. "I'm calling the state medical board and the police. This is criminal. This is exactly the kind of reckless, unlicensed practice I've been documenting since your first week." Sarah set down the scalpel with steady hands. She removed her gloves. She did not acknowledge Pierce's voice at all, did not turn to face him, did not offer any explanation or defense. She simply turned toward Sergeant Torres and looked at him for exactly 1 second, their eyes meeting, her face offering nothing but the message, "You're breathing." Then she turned toward the security officers who'd appeared in the doorway and walked toward them with the kind of composure that belonged to someone who'd already calculated every consequence and decided it was a price worth paying. Her badge was confiscated at the main lobby desk. The plastic suddenly felt heavy in her hand, a thing that had defined her presence for 3 months now reduced to a hospital property to be catalogued and filed. Pierce's voice followed her toward the exit doors. "You'll never work in healthcare again. I'll make sure of that. Florence." He used the nickname like a curse, like a weapon, like he'd finally discovered the thing that would break her. She walked through the automatic doors into the pre-dawn darkness and didn't look back. The Starlight Diner on Victory Drive was open 24 hours, the kind of place that served the night shift and the insomniacs and the people whose lives had just exploded. Sarah sat in a corner booth at 03 for 5 hours, her coffee cooling in the cup in front of her, her reflection staring back from the dark window of the glass. Not the nurse. Not the captain. Just the empty space between two identities that both just failed. Rain started falling outside, hammering the parking lot like applause, and she watched each drop hit the asphalt and disappear. Her phone buzzed at 0401. The encrypted message was exactly what she'd been expecting: cover burned. Mission scrubbed. Extraction initiated. She didn't respond. She simply sat there as dawn began to creep across Savannah in shades of gray and gold, as the morning shift arrived and the diner filled with hospital workers heading into the day, as the world continued moving forward without acknowledging that anything had changed. The faded Special Forces patch sewn inside her jacket lining was the only thing that felt real anymore. She could feel it there, pressed against her ribs like proof that something in her remained unchanged, unmocked, unbroken. She ordered more coffee from the waitress, who didn't ask questions and didn't seem to recognize her. In the fluorescent light of the diner, she was just another person sitting alone at dawn, waiting for something, running from something, or both. The coffee tasted like failure and exhaustion and the particular emptiness that comes when you choose the right thing and lose everything for it. But Torres was breathing. That was the one thing that remained true. Whatever came next, whatever happened with the board, the police, the fabricated evidence and the careful dismantling of her life, that was one thing that remained. She pulled out her phone and typed a response to the encrypted message: "Torres is stable. Mission objective secured. Standing by." Then she closed her eyes and waited for whatever came next. The flagged security clearance sat in a federal database for exactly 48 hours before the cascade began. Routine background refresh. Standard protocol. The kind of bureaucratic tick that nobody noticed until it triggered everything else. At Cedar Creek Medical VA Hospital in Savannah, the morning of the flag, Dr. Marcus Pierce walked into his office at 7:15 a.m. to find a Marine colonel sitting in the chair across from his desk. Not waiting in reception. Not waiting in the hallway. Seated. Patient. The kind of calm that comes from knowing you hold every card in the game. Colonel James Mercer was tall enough that his dress blue seemed to take up the entire room. No briefcase. No folder. Just a classified file folder marked with red and white striping, an eyes the color of gunmetal that had seen things Pierce's entire career would never touch. Pierce's first instinct was to assert authority. This was his office. His hospital. His domain. He'd spent 3 months systematically dismantling a nurse's reputation with phone calls and whispers. Surely one Marine colonel could be managed with the right tone. "Colonel, I'm not sure what brings you to Cedar Creek, but I have a full surgical schedule and..." "You're clear for the next hour," Mercer said. Not a request. It was a command wrapped in polite syntax, and Pierce heard it clearly. "We need to discuss Captain Sarah Chen's classified assignment." The name hung in the air like a defibrillator shock. Pierce's stomach dropped 3 floors. He sat down slowly. "I don't know what you're referring to. That woman has fabricated credentials. I have documentation. You have a forged disciplinary record created 2 days ago at 10:43 p.m. from your office computer," Mercer said, opening the classified file. "You have falsified witness statements signed by staff members who were not present. You have a memo recommending Captain Chen's termination and criminal prosecution based on medical negligence charges that you retroactively invented after she performed an emergency needle decompression that saved Sergeant Torres's life. The same procedure you would have ordered done. The same save you would have taken credit for. Pierce's hands trembled. Actually trembled. The controlled man, the one who'd perfected institutional power, whose words had turned colleagues against Sarah in committee meetings and hallway conversations, whose phone calls had poisoned the entire night shift against her, that man was dissolving. This is a misunderstanding. I was protecting hospital protocol. Patient safety. You were protecting your ego, Mercer said flatly. 3 months ago, a nurse corrected your dosage calculation in front of an intern. Instead of accepting feedback, you spent 12 weeks orchestrating her professional destruction. Then she saved a life by doing exactly what you claimed was dangerous overreach. So you doubled down. Fabricated documents. Made calls to the state medical board claiming she had stolen Vela. Contacted local news stations offering them a story about fraudulent military service. All while she was completing a classified counterintelligence operation you had no authority to interfere with. The door opened. General Catherine Kensington walked in, 2 stars gleaming on each shoulder. The kind of presence that made the air pressure change, that commanded respect the way gravity commands objects to fall. She didn't sit. She stood, and Pierce felt every inch of the height difference. Behind her, Agent Foster from the FBI, her expression carved from ice. The general spoke 3 words, "Where is Captain Chen?" "Second floor. Northern Ward," Mercer said. "She's with Sergeant Torres during his PT session." The general nodded once. "Bring her to the main corridor. Now." She looked at Pierce like he was an interesting bacteria sample under glass. "You're about to meet the consequences of every choice you made." They walked down the hallway as a unit. Mercer, Kensington, Foster, and 3 FBI agents whose presence seemed to compress the air around them. Hospital staff froze as the military procession moved through Cedar Creek. That kind of authority didn't walk hospital corridors. That was the kind of power that happened on television, in documentaries, in other people's stories. Not here. Not in a VA hospital in Savannah at 8:40 a.m. on a Thursday. Pierce followed behind, his confidence gutted. He'd felt powerful when he was destroying Sarah's reputation. He'd felt clever. Now he felt like a man walking toward his own execution, and there was nothing to do but watch it happen. They gathered in the main corridor, near the nurse's station. Sarah appeared, moving with Torres in his wheelchair, both of them pausing when they saw the general and colonel. She straightened immediately, recognizing the rank insignia. The military recognizes itself. Her eyes went wide for exactly 1 fraction of a second. Then her composure locked into place, and she came to attention, Torres looking between them in confusion. General Kensington stepped forward. "Captain Chen. Permission to address the hospital staff." "Permission granted," Sarah replied, her voice steady as surgical hands. The general raised her voice so every staff member in the northern corridor could hear. "I am reading a citation. Silver Star. For conspicuous gallantry during Operation Resolute Dragon, Captain Sarah Chen rendered aid under sustained enemy fire to multiple casualties within the Bagram operational theater, maintaining medical protocols under conditions exceeding standard combat stress indices. Her actions directly resulted in the survival of 7 wounded soldiers who would have died without her intervention. For this service, the United States Army awarded her the Silver Star in 2019. For this service, she was transferred to classified duty assignments in 2022. And for this service, she was assigned to Cedar Creek Medical VA Hospital under federal counterintelligence protocols to investigate medication irregularities potentially connected to a 2021 Bagram supply chain breach. The silence was the kind of silence that happens when the entire world shifts on its axis. Nurses who had turned their backs at the vending machine stood frozen. Dr. Thompson, who had questioned every one of Sarah's clinical decisions, gripped his clipboard like a life preserver. Security Officer Williams looked ill. The rumor mill that Pierce had constructed so carefully, brick by brick, collapsed like a house of cards exposed to hurricane wind. Pierce's voice cut through, shrill and desperate. "This is obviously fabricated. I've already contacted the state medical board. I have documentation." "You have fraud," Agent Foster said, stepping forward with her laptop. The screen displayed his emails, his forged documents, his attempt to create false disciplinary records. Her voice was the sound of a filing cabinet closing on a career. "Everything you submitted to the hospital board on November 14th was created using your office computer between 10:43 p.m. and 1:37 a.m. We have forensic analysis. We have your email timestamps. We have your calls to local news outlets attempting to plant a story about stolen Vela. We have your memo recommending her termination." General Kensington's voice dropped to a register that carried more weight than any shout. "You had a competent medical professional on your staff. She was discreet. She was professional. She was doing her job. And instead of allowing her to work, you weaponized your institutional position because you couldn't accept correction from someone without a medical school pedigree. Then, when she saved a life using the exact skills that you claimed were dangerous, you attempted to destroy her criminally. You nearly killed Sergeant Torres through institutional negligence. You fabricated evidence against the person who saved him. You obstructed a federal investigation. And why?" Wounded pride. Pierce opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. There were no words left. Everything he had constructed, the authority, the respect, the careful social architecture of his superiority, evaporated like antiseptic on warm skin. "Dr. Marcus Pierce," Agent Foster said, "you're under arrest for obstruction of justice, falsification of federal documents, and conspiracy to interfere with a classified military operation." The FBI agents moved with practiced efficiency. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists with a sound like destiny arriving. His briefcase fell to the floor. Papers scattered across tile, medical charts and memos and the accumulated debris of his career. He tried to speak, to assert something, anything, but the words came out in fragments. "This is insane. I'm the chief of staff. I was protecting this hospital. I was." They walked him out. Past the vending machine. Past the nurse's station where Sarah had been ignored. Past the conference room where he'd held grand rounds and destroyed her reputation with perfectly documented medical notes held up like evidence of a crime. Past every staff member who had believed his whispers, accepted his narrative, participated in the social execution of a woman doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing. Nobody looked away. The perp walk happened at 1400 hours. 1:40 p.m., when the hospital corridors were busiest. Visiting hours. Staff change. Maximum visibility. Sarah watched from the second-floor balcony beside Colonel Mercer as Dr. Pierce, grey-faced and trembling in a way that made his hands shake against the handcuffs, was escorted by FBI agents through the main lobby. His shoes shuffled against tile that had once echoed with his confident footsteps. His polished veneer was gone. What remained was a small man whose institutional power had been stripped away, leaving only the person underneath, the one who'd chosen revenge over grace, ego over service, destruction over compassion. He glanced up once, looking for something, maybe understanding, maybe mercy. Sarah's expression remained composed. She'd spent months silent while he dismantled her reputation. She could afford 30 seconds of watching his world collapse. Colonel Mercer placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity. The hand of someone who understood what it cost to stay silent while being destroyed. 6 months later, Sarah stood in her new office on the 3rd floor of Cedar Creek Medical VA Hospital. The nameplate on the door read Director of Veterans Crisis Response, Captain Sarah Chen, U.S. Army Special Forces. Through the window, she could see the loading bay where a medical supply van pulled up under guard supervision. Dr. Pierce, in a prison work release vest, stepped out to unload boxes. His medical license was revoked. His career was destroyed. His freedom was conditional. He would drive that van for 18 months, minimum. Then probation. Then whatever came after, if anything came at all. Sergeant Torres wheeled into her office without knocking, dropping a classified folder on her desk with the kind of casual urgency that came from people who knew lives were at stake. 3 more cases. Same irregularities. Your investigation expanded. He was healed now, mostly. The spinal damage still caused pain, chronic, persistent, the kind that taught you what your body was capable of enduring. But he was alive. He was working again. He was here. Sarah picked up the object she'd finally retrieved from the inside pocket of her old uniform jacket. The faded Special Forces unit patch. The one that had pressed against her ribs through every humiliation, every moment she stood silent while Pierce attacked her reputation. She'd mounted it in a frame beside her captain's bars, and now she held the frame up to the window light. The patch was worn, nearly colorless, threadbare at the edges. It had been through Bagram. Through 3 years of classified duty. Through the supply closet at 4 a.m. when she'd allowed herself 3 breaths of something like despair. Dr. Ramirez appeared in the doorway, hesitant. Captain Chen, I know my apology was inadequate. But I've been teaching residents about confirmation bias. About institutional power and how it corrupts judgment. Using your case as a foundation. If that's appropriate. Sarah considered this. The medical director who'd believed Pierce's whispers. Who'd questioned her clinical assessments. Who'd participated, however passively, in her humiliation. Now trying to transform that failure into education. The kind of redemption that actually meant something, not forgiveness, but better judgment going forward. Make sure they understand what they missed, Sarah said quietly. Make sure they learn the cost of choosing silence. Ramirez nodded and left. Sarah turned back to the patch. The stitching on one corner had come loose long ago. The colors had faded from sun exposure and sweat. But the emblem was still visible if you knew how to look. A sword over a shield. The motto at the base, De Represso Liber. From oppression, liberation. She'd been oppressed. Not by the enemy. By the man who was supposed to lead the institution that healed veterans. And she'd liberated herself by refusing to break, by maintaining her composure when breaking would have been justified, by trusting that the truth would eventually become visible to people with eyes to see. Torres opened another file. Next case is a Marine. 26 years old. Medication irregularities started 3 weeks after his discharge. Someone's moving pills. Same pattern as before. Sarah set down the frame and pulled on latex gloves with a snap of finality. Tell me everything. She was a nurse again, officially, though she'd never stopped being a captain. The 2 identities had merged, finally, into something whole. She could help people now. Openly. With institutional authority aligned with her actual mission. Her phone buzzed. A text from General Kensington, good work on Pierce. Pentagon wants to replicate your protocol in 3 more medical facilities. Your methods are now federal standard for protecting classified personnel in civilian institutions. Briefing next week. Sarah smiled, actually smiled, the kind that transformed her entire face. Affirmative, she typed back. The folder on her desk was thick with the next veteran's story. Another life. Another situation where someone's quiet competence had been underestimated, undervalued, nearly destroyed by someone wielding institutional power like a weapon. Sarah had been that person. Now she was the person who prevented it from happening to others. On her desk, a handwritten note in General Kensington's script, power is not a title. Power is the ability to help. Sarah allowed herself a moment to absorb that truth. Then she opened the Marine's file, her hand steady, her composure absolute, and began to work. If you haven't already, please like this video and subscribe to see more stories about the quiet heroes doing dangerous work in plain sight. And in the comments, tell us, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? What happened when the truth finally came out? Stay safe out there.